counselor in UNHCR's HQ team based in Copenhagen, overseeing the data and evidence function on refugee education. I wanted to start off by thanking INEE for generously hosting this webinar, and to all of the participants that are joining us today as speakers, including our UNHCR West and Central Africa Regional Bureau, the UNESCO Section for Migration, Displacement, Emergencies, and Education team, and the LAC Regional Office, as well as the Overseas Development Institute and UNICEF. I also want to highlight the importance of the work that has been done around inclusion by several of the institutions that I just mentioned. It comes at a really critical time with the Global Refugee Forum, the GRF, just around the corner next week. The GRF presents a really unique opportunity to rally around efforts to strengthen the commitments made around the Global Compact on refugees. A really key and central component of the education mega pledge that is in place for the GRF has been to work towards inclusion of the forcibly displaced in national education systems. The current wording of the education mega pledge indicates that our shared collective vision is for all refugee children to have access to safe, quality, and relevant education opportunities, and for them to be included in national education systems. The work that will be presented today is centered around this last tenet, and I have two remarks in this regard. The first one is that data plays a really crucial role in being able to understand to what degree forcibly displaced children and youth and refugees in particular are accessing national education systems and learning. At the same time, a favorable policy environment is a precondition for inclusion, but does not guarantee that all children are effectively included, as this year's GCR report has demonstrated. Just a couple of figures. According to the latest statistics from our flagship report, Global Trends, as of June 2022, the number of refugees stood at slightly above 35 million. Of the 15.5 million school-aged refugee children, slightly more than half were estimated to be out of school. We know that access to education is especially restricted at the secondary and tertiary levels. I hope that these figures are a sobering reminder of the work that still needs to be done to further advance in this area as we work towards inclusion. And with these key figures in mind, I will hand over to the first speaker. I will ask each of the speakers to please introduce themselves at the beginning of their intervention. Over to Rachel from ODI. Thanks.
Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for inviting me to this webinar. I'm going to speak about some work that we at ODI did working with UNICEF's Innocenti Research Centre last year. This project was to synthesize evidence on educational inclusion of refugee learners, to look at best practices, and involved research, literature review-based research, case studies in Ecuador and Rwanda, and interviews with global stakeholders. So could we have the first slide, please? And the next one. Thank you. So just a couple of definitions to get started. The definition we worked with was the UNESCO definition of educational inclusion, a process that helps to overcome barriers limiting the presence, participation, and achievement of learners. And by national education systems, we're primarily referring to the public system, while recognizing that in different countries, educational provision is a mix of state-provided, private, faith, and NGO provision. Inclusion of refugee learners in national education systems seems a simple idea on the surface, but in practice, there are many aspects to consider. One of the driving factors behind the push for educational inclusion is a recognition that increasingly displacement is long-term. Refugee students might spend their whole cycle in a host country, and that education can play a vital role in helping them integrate into and contribute to their host countries. We made use of a couple of existing frameworks around educational inclusion. one specific to refugee students and one that's broader. So we drew on the work of Sarah Dryden-Peterson, which many others will be familiar with, who've suggested that it's useful to distinguish between structural aspects of inclusion, such as aspects of access to services, and relational aspects, such as a socio-cultural process promoting the feelings of belonging of individual students and social cohesion of groups. We also drew on an OECD study of education and inclusion that was broader than only inclusion of refugee students, which distinguished 5 sets of factors that enable inclusion. And we've summarized those in the center of this diagram, related to governance, resourcing, capacity of educational systems, school level provision, and evaluating and monitoring, which I think is perhaps better expressed more broadly as data and accountability systems. So these frameworks show that educational inclusion both needs a supportive political and budgetary environment, and also fundamentally depends on the approach and ethos of individual educational institutions and communities. Could we have the next slide, please? So drawing on these 2 frameworks and the review of literature that I mentioned earlier, with a particular focus on trying to understand refugees' experiences and what had enabled positive experiences, we developed a continuum of inclusion, which broadly distinguished 3 types of contexts and situations. The first is where refugee learners are mostly in parallel provision, such as non-formal provision, or in schools where they don't use host country curricula. A second, where refugee learners are partially included in national systems. For example, they can attend national schools, but only with some of the rights of host country students, or at different times from them. And a third one, where refugee learners are more or less fully included in national systems on the same basis as their host country counterparts. In any given country, one or more of these situations might apply. For example, in a country that allows refugee learners to access national provision, those who are settled might be attending public institutions, whereas children in extended transit might be largely accessing non-formal provision, if they're even obtaining any education at all. So this slide shows them the continuum that we've drawn up, distinguishing 10 different dimensions. And of course, these are very summarized and generalized and would need to be contextualized in a specific place. And what we hope the continuum helps is to identify particular bottlenecks or barriers to inclusion. So a country might, for example, allow refugee learners to access national systems, but not offer them the same kinds of social protection and financial support as host country children are eligible for. And in practice, although the legal environment is supportive, finance is a critical barrier. Or it might not recognize the qualifications of refugee teachers and require them to be recertified, meaning that it's losing access to a talented and experienced pool of teachers who share language and culture with refugee students. So having developed this continuum, we were tasked to try to turn it into a tool that can be used more specifically to guide thinking and planning, and to help identify concrete ways to promote inclusion, with the aim that this could be validated, field tested, and improved. So could we have the next slide, please? And the question, so it's a set of questions, and the questions in this framework are all aimed at strengthening inclusion in each kind of context. And of course, they're not the only questions that could be asked, but we hope that they could inspire more suitable ones if they don't fit to a particular context. And I should also say we started off with many more questions, which have been pared down to keep this simple and not too crowded. And you can see they span both macro aspects of policies, such as how inclusion of refugee learners is financed, through to more micro level school practices and everything in between. I'm not going to go through every question on the slide, but I'm just going to focus on a few in more detail that emerged really strongly from our interviews and consultations, both for this project and in wider work supporting children on the move. So in the legal frameworks line, you'll see a question on documentation barriers. This is an issue that's come up quite a bit in work we've done in Latin America, around the requirement for particular kinds of documentation to be able to enter or progress in school. So that could be proof of identity, it could be proof of residency, or it could be certified transcripts of previous studies. In recent years, several countries in South America have reduced the documentation barriers faced by Venezuelan students to facilitate their inclusion, and that's a positive practice that could be considered in other contexts where documentation forms a barrier. Moving down to the next group of resourcing related issues, I wanted to highlight social protection. Studies with children and families often highlight the huge significance of financial barriers, and sometimes social protection funding for displaced students is available through the humanitarian system, sometimes through the national system, but often there isn't any, or at least it's not sufficient. And so because this is such a huge barrier, that's why we have highlighted that as a particular set of questions. And you'll see in the national system part of that line, we also had a question about what provisions are in place for groups of learners with additional needs. It was really striking as we worked on this study how rarely efforts to address barriers experienced by refugee students with disabilities were mentioned. A few more of the initiatives and studies we looked at did focus on gender-related barriers, but not necessarily systematically. Could I have the next slide, please? So in the next set of questions, you'll see that there are questions around security and the amount and the level of facilities, both of which again have emerged as really major barriers to refugee students' inclusion. Security, of course, is a concern for all students, but it's often a particular barrier for adolescent girls. In relation to teachers, this is a good example of where we think that space hasn't enabled all the relevant questions to be asked, and they could be contextualized further. So these questions are largely around inclusion of refugee teachers, which, as we mentioned earlier, is so important to make use of their skills to support transitions of children into a new curriculum and context. But it's not the only set of issues. And another that came up a lot in the studies we looked at was around around support for host country teachers to better include students from a refugee background. So studies that we reviewed from contexts like Brazil and Turkey, for example, highlighted that teachers aren't necessarily fully prepared to support students from different language backgrounds with different levels of learning or familiarity with the host country curriculum. So some additional questions that could be asked here would focus on the kinds of pre and in-service training for teachers to support diverse learners, including those from refugee backgrounds, and the extent of ongoing support like classroom assistance or language learning materials. Following on a bit more on language, worldwide, the majority of displacement is to nearby countries, but that doesn't always mean that the language of instruction will necessarily be one that's familiar to students, as it also may not have been in their home country. If refugee learners are to follow the host country's curriculum in its language of instruction, they may need additional support to do so. So as well as classroom assistance, that could be things like language classes for children already in the school system, bilingual preschools, or social leisure activities that are intended to help with both language learning and social integration. So those are some of the things that are perhaps kind of not absolutely apparent in that question on the final side about the curriculum and classroom practices promote social integration, but those are some of the things that could include. Moving to the next slide and the final blocks of the tool, we come to assessment and certification. This is an issue that has loomed large again in our studies in Latin America and the Caribbean. In many countries in the region, refugee students are allowed to attend public schools and to take school leaving exams, but in some they can't receive certification, or they can only do so if they've been able to provide the relevant documents showing their refugee or migration status. And adolescents in the studies we reviewed specifically mentioned not being able to obtain certification as a barrier to studying at upper secondary level, in vocational training, or in higher education. It's a kind of bottleneck that could be creatively addressed, and learning passports, such as UNICEF has been working on, could help here. As you can see, the final set of issues in this tool are around inclusion in education data systems, and that's something that other presenters are going to focus on. So I'll stop now and give the floor to our UNESCO colleagues. And of course, I'm really happy to answer any questions when we come to that part of the session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for getting us started with the topic of inclusion and how all of our work kind of anchors into it. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us on this webinar today. My name is Bindu Sani, and I work at UNESCO Section for Migration, Displacement, Emergencies in Education on data and AI data and statistics. I'm joined today by my colleagues Arthur Burkowski and Lily Kalake, who will be presenting the key highlights of the work that we've been doing with UNHCR over the last couple of years on building the evidence base on the inclusion of refugees in national education systems from a data and policy perspective. Now, this work reiterates and builds on UNESCO's commitments from the 2019 GRF pledge, contributes to fulfilling our pledge for the upcoming GRF, which is focusing on really fostering greater inclusion of refugees in national education systems. These efforts also lie in close conjunction with the call to action on education in crisis situations, launched during the Transforming Education Summit in 2022, and aligns closely with our commitments to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development on achieving quality, equitable, and lifelong learning for all, including refugees, and ensuring we leave no one behind. Next slide, please. On that note, I am truly delighted to announce today, fresh off the press, the official launch of our joint publication on refugee inclusion in national education systems. This work is based on a comprehensive review of data and policies in the top 35 refugee hosting countries, complemented by qualitative research in 7 case study countries that identify promising practices, key enablers, and barriers on inclusion that countries experienced along the way. The QR code on the screen will direct you to the UNESCO web pages with access to both publications, country background papers, and databases that have informed the development of these reports. Lastly, I'd like to express my sincerest thanks to the team of researchers who carried out the field research, conducted the data and policy reviews, and our UNESCO and UNHCR country office colleagues and Ministry of Education reps, and peer reviewers who provided their unflinching support in bringing this work to life. So without further ado, I now hand it over to my colleagues, Arthur Burkowski and Lily Kalake, the lead authors of the reports, to present the key findings. Thank you. Over to you, Arthur.
Thank you, Bindu. So I'm Arthur, and I'll take you through a little bit how these two reports are linked. So next slide, please. So we wanted to make sure that we don't talk about data or policy in isolation. And for us, this really meant trying to see how they're linked. And so we call this the policy data nexus, but really not to worry, it's not anything really complicated. It's really just about the intersection between education policy and education data systems. As we saw with Rachel's presentation, education data systems and education policy can interact in very interesting ways, but it's not really clear how often data speaks to policy or how often policy speaks to data. So we are really trying to understand this component of it. And you can see a sort of crude illustration of how these two things might interact here. So next slide, please. And Bindu has already mentioned this, but I'll just dive in again a little bit on what we did. We did an open source review of policy and data in the top 35 low and middle income countries, refugee hosting countries, as of September 2021. You can see the countries here on the slide. And to complement this, we did 7 case studies. Again, the countries are sort of listed there on the left-hand side. And for both the policy and data reviews, we tried to be as comprehensive as possible, covering a set of, I think, 10 policies consistently across 35 countries, and covering, as we'll see in a little bit more detail later, over 600 data sources for the data review across these 35 countries. So quite comprehensive, and really trying to get a sort of as global a picture as possible as we can. So without further ado, let's launch into the findings. I'll hand over to my colleague Lily to take us through a little bit of the policy work.
Thanks, Arthur, and we can move to the next slide here. So what you'll see on the screen here is what we're calling a policy pathway for refugee inclusion. And to first kind of explain how we arrived at this framework, pretty early on in our research, we realized that focusing on policies that grant refugees access to schools wasn't enough, and that to really understand refugee inclusion, we needed to take a broader perspective. And so we developed this framework, which looks at 10 aspects of policy across 3 phases, starting from the moment of arrival. So a key starting point for us was to consider how host governments provide legal status and documentation to refugees. So we wanted to consider whether refugees are being granted refugee status or whether they're given an alternative form of documentation like a temporary protection status, or whether it's UNHCR rather than the government who's registering and providing documents to refugees. And we knew we wanted to start here because, as we heard in the first presentation, documentation or lack thereof is often a key obstacle for refugees to actually enroll in school. And so moving along this pathway within education policy, we looked at access to schools, but we also looked at policies relating to learning environments. And so this includes policies that ensure a safe learning environment, as well as policies that grant access to quality learning conditions, meaning things like language courses and academic support to meet the specific needs of refugees. And then we're also considering whether refugees are able to progress through all grades and all levels, whether they can certify their learning, and finally, whether they have access to higher ed. And then in this last phase of the pathway, we considered policies relating to freedom of movement, the right to work, and access to permanent legal status. So all falling under this umbrella of local integration. And one thing I want to note here is that although they're being presented in this way, progress along this pathway is often not linear. Refugees don't necessarily obtain documentation before they enroll in school. And things like freedom of movement are relevant not only in this last phase, but also within the education cycle. But with that being said, what we really wanted to do was to take a more holistic view of refugee education and think about looking beyond just guaranteeing that refugees have access to classrooms, but thinking about the purposes of refugee education and how refugees can use what they learn in school to build a future and to gain a sense of belonging in the host society. And I think we can move here to the next slide. And I see Rachel has her hand raised. Rachel, did you want to come in?
No, sorry, that's an accident.
Okay, no worries. So on this next slide is a summary of a few key findings from our policy review. So as mentioned, as part of the qualitative research for this project, we reviewed over 400 policies for variables across these key aspects of inclusion. So documentation, access to schools, safety, and so on. And one key finding that came out of our review was that of the 35 countries, 26 have policies in place that explicitly guarantee refugees access to the national education system. And this includes all 12 countries that were reviewed in Africa and all 8 in Latin America and the Caribbean. However, with that being said, when we take that step back to look at inclusion more broadly, we find that there are some gaps in guaranteeing that full pathway to inclusion. So for example, only 14 of the 26 grant refugee status to the population of concern. And then in the other 12, refugees are granted alternative forms of status, like a temporary protection status, or they're registered by UNHCR, any of which typically offer a lower degree of protection than refugee status. And another key finding was that in 11 of these 26 countries, refugees are either not permitted to work or they're limited in the kind of work that they can perform. And so their ability to use what they've learned in school and to integrate into the host society is rather limited. And what's more, while progress has been made in getting refugees into classrooms, the focus remains overwhelmingly on access, and it misses a lot of these other key aspects that we saw on the last slide. So for example, on safety and on quality, and on making sure that refugees can progress throughout the entire cycle. And then quickly, of the remaining 9, it's worth noting that in most of these other 9 countries, legal frameworks for refugees are non-existent or they're very limited. And many of these countries aren't bound by international or domestic laws to protect refugees. And so as a result, pathways for refugees to gain status, to access schools, or to work are all very limited. And so this is really just to provide kind of an overview of some of our findings. As mentioned, the database for this project is available for download on our website, and we would encourage you to reference it and make use of it. And next, we'll take a look at some of the findings from the data review. So I think we can move to the next slide, and I'll pass it back to Archer.
Thanks, Lily. So on the data side, really, we focused on the education components within that policy pathway, really to try to understand what education data we have for refugee students. And really, I guess, as a surprise to no one who's worked in this field, there's very little data on refugee education beyond access to schools and quality learning conditions to some extent. But here, there's quite a big caveat, which I'll get to in a second. So for this, part of the research, we, as I said, reviewed 620 data collection exercises over these 35 countries. And this was a wide range of data collection exercises, things like household survey, census, learning assessments, both international and national, education management information systems where we had access to the questionnaires. And we did this across 140 odd variables and looked at, again, these sort of 5 policy areas, and looking at whether they included refugees in the sample and whether they included refugee identification questions within them. So the chart you're seeing here really tries to break down how much we do know about, or we could know about, refugee education, and how much there's still left to know in terms of how included they are in data collection exercises. So if you see the orange and blue bars together, basically this is where refugees were included, or we might be able to glean some information about refugee education because we ask some sort of refugee identification questions. Where you see the green bars, this is where there is information on access to schools, but refugees are in no way included. And so, as you can see, with the addition of some at least identification questions, we could actually have a lot more information about refugees, even those that are incidentally included rather than purposefully included in data collection exercises. And to echo Lily's point that she just made on policies, the same is true on the data side, right? Data on safety and quality meaning things beyond literacy, is actually very limited. What we do, we know very little about higher level learning, for example, and very little about things like peer violence and safety of schools in general. So are these schools that have, let's say, safe infrastructure? We don't know. And so these are big gaps in our knowledge, right? And the same for higher education. We know a lot about access for pre-primary to secondary education. On the tertiary level, we know very little. And this is quite concerning, as it's also a big population group. So this is very abstract and global, and I want to give you a sort of concrete example of this. So if we go to the next slide, please. Here you have an example for Peru, where we're merging these policy pathways that Lily mentioned and trying to bring in the data and try to understand where there is data for each of these policy pathway steps, right? And you can see here, we're talking about Venezuelans in regular status, and Peru is doing great, right? We have a data on most of the policy aspects that we talk about here. Not all, but still, this is pretty good, right? We have data on access, we have some data on learning and progression, for example, but not everything is there. However, and this is what I want to emphasize, is that there's a lack of disaggregation in this data. So if we go to the next slide, please, then we can see that when we talk about Venezuelans in irregular status, those that do not have one of the several regularized temporary protections, then we don't actually know as much. And this is the key importance of disaggregation, even once we get to refugee status, right? So talking about refugee boys, refugee girls, refugees in irregular status versus those in regular status. And this is actually not to say that Peru is doing badly or the Ministry of Education is doing badly, quite the opposite, actually, in that it's hard to capture irregular status in general, and the Ministry of Education manages to capture those that are enrolled but do not have documentation. It's quite an achievement in and of itself. So this is more a function of the policy environment not being favorable to this data being captured in overall. And yeah, so what we see here is that sometimes policy and data speak to each other, but there is data missing even where policies exist on specific aspects, as we saw with those Venezuelans in regular status. And again, just to emphasize key importance of disaggregation within refugee status, which is something we're still quite a long way from, but our research shows that it's quite critical. Now I'm going to hand back to Lily to give us a positive spin on sort of the enablers and constraints of doing so.
Yeah, so through our 7 case studies, we identified some key elements that play a critical role in enabling the development of these inclusive policies and data collection efforts, as well as barriers to inclusion. So we've grouped these factors into these 5 broad categories that you see on the screen here, with the 3 across the top. focusing more so on internal factors. So the first of these is political will. And here we're talking about having sustained long-term political commitment from the national authorities, along with backing from the public. The second is interagency coordination. And so here we're talking about coordination occurring within the country between agencies like the Ministry of Education and the authority overseeing refugee or migrant affairs, as well as between national and subnational levels of government. And then the third factor has to do with institutional capacity. So we're talking about having the necessary technical, financial, human resources in place to support inclusion. And then at the bottom, forming a kind of a foundation to all of these are two elements that we identified as more external factors. And so the first of these is financing, whether there's a sustained and predictable funding source to support inclusive measures, whether from domestic funding or external donors. And finally, international cooperation, referring broadly speaking to support from the international community. So this encompasses guidance, technical training, capacity building, policy advice, and any other kind of support. So these are the broad categories of factors that we identified as enablers and barriers. And then if we can move to the next slide, we'll see some examples of where these factors come into play in our 7 case study countries. And before I get into these examples, I just want to say up front that this figure isn't meant to be comprehensive and it doesn't include all of our findings. So we aren't saying that political will doesn't exist in certain countries or that these are the only countries that have capacity or that have financing, but rather we wanted to highlight select findings that stood out to us, with the full findings available in the report and in the case studies on our website. So first off, in several countries, political will leads the list of enabling factors. And to give an example of this, one of our findings was that in Chad, there are officials who have lived experience as refugees who are now serving in key policymaking roles. And at the same time, there's public support for refugees among host communities and together, these two factors create the supportive environment in which inclusion can occur. On the flip side, in other case studies, we saw low levels of political will impeding progress towards inclusion. So for example, in the case of Peru, there are low levels of political will and public support for Venezuelans that result in part from waves of xenophobia among the public, as well as government turnover in recent years. And so as a result, as we saw in the pathways a few slides ago, the scope for inclusion is more limited. Another common barrier was found to be low capacity of national systems. So in several countries, there's low capacity or resources in the education sector overall. And so there's limited capability to deliver quality education or to produce data on national students. And so the capacity to do so for refugee students is also limited. And then in terms of external factors, donor support was identified as a key enabler for several case studies. And this includes countries like Jordan, where funding received from donors through the Jordan Compact has allowed for a more inclusive policy environment. And then finally, international and regional cooperation more broadly was a key enabling factor, taking different forms in different countries. So in countries like Chad, this includes technical support and guidance from UNHCR, which key informants noted was really key to advancing inclusion. Whereas in Peru and other Latin American countries, participation in regional coordination platforms like the R4V has played an important role in shaping inclusive policies, as well as in disseminating key data on refugee education. So these are a few of the key findings on enablers and barriers that emerged from the case studies, and we can move here to the next slide, and I'll pass it back over to Artur for some key messages.
Thanks, Lily. So to wrap all this up and to give you the sort of 3 main points that we want you to take away from this, if you're not going to read the report, though I do encourage you to do so, we've tried to make it as readable as possible. There's sort of 3 key points. Really is that while there is high levels of inclusion in national systems, overall, policies often fall short of long-term solutions, right? So this means that even if there is inclusion in education in this sort of superficial way, it doesn't necessarily mean progression through the system, and then later on in sort of more local integration into, let's say, the workplace, the labor market, and so on, right? So this is it's key to think about education policies as part of a holistic package of policies, not just those isolated to education, right? And documentation is a key example of this, I think. The other is that refugee education inclusion in data systems, as you saw, is very low overall, but particularly low on issues of safety and quality. And again, this is where policies for refugee education are often lacking as well. And so there's a need to implement the recommendations from the expert group on refugee, IDP, and statelessness statistics, and really integrate questions on refugee education throughout data collection exercises as much as possible. And then the national commitment is really crucial and needs to be supported by international cooperation to include refugees in education policy and data systems. We've seen again and again in our case studies where there is this commitment and international cooperation, there is a higher level of inclusion of refugees in education policy and data. So it's really critical to cultivate partnerships between global actors and national actors to go forward and to really include refugees in education systems. So I think that's it for me, and I'm going to hand back to Bindu one final time, and over to you.
Thank you, Arthur and Lily. Colleagues, just to round it all up, we are just going to put up the QR code for the reports for any of you who may have missed it on the first few slides that were introduced. And also to mention that the reports will be available in Spanish, French, and Arabic in the next few weeks, so do watch the space. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to the next speaker, who's Priscilla Gomez from UNHCR. Priscilla, over to you.
Thank you, Bintu. Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. We can go to the next slide straight. So welcome to West and Central Africa. I'll be talking about the region covered by the Regional Bureau for West and Central Africa of UNHCR, which covers 21 countries, in which we have a total of 13.4 million forcibly displaced and stateless persons. Among them includes 2.2 million refugees and asylum seekers, and the majority are originating from Sudan, CAR, and Nigeria. As you can see in this graph, which are a bit small, the main countries of asylums are Chad, with over 1 million refugees, followed by Cameroon and Niger. Compared to last year, the number of refugees and asylum seekers in the region has increased by 36%, mainly since the spring, as a result of the ongoing crisis in Sudan and the deterioration of the security situation in Central Sahel. The 8.1 million IDPs show the fragility of the security situation in the region, with Nigeria, Burkina Faso, Cameroon being the most affected states. Next slide, please. We can go to the next slide. Thank you. So the West and Central Africa region faces multiple humanitarian and development challenges, but this has not stopped governments and people from showing incredible solidarity with refugees. Overall, there are no legal barriers to refugee education in the region, and inclusion in national education systems is the approach adopted in all countries. Refugees have access to national schools and follow the host country curriculum. In countries where we have refugee camps, camp schools are recognized by the government and part of the national system, even if UNHCR is still playing an important role in the financing of school and teachers, etc. So although national laws generally provide that all children should be able to enroll in formal, non-formal, and vocational systems, compulsory education for refugee children is still not enforced. And although refugees have access to national schools, this inclusion is not yet systematically reflected in national sectoral plans and budgets. Moreover, access to the work market can be limited or restricted after studies. In this region, the education sector suffers a lot from a chronic lack of attention and funding, and this is obviously even more true in areas affected by conflict and displacement. And as you can see on the slide, it's important to note recurrent school closures due to insecurity and attacks specifically targeting education, particularly in the Sahel and the Lake Chad region. Next slide. So in this slide, a few case statistics. According to data available, 67% of refugee children may be out of school. As we saw earlier, the former presentation, lack of inclusion or disaggregation in national MS is a challenge to capture accurate refugee data, particularly since, as we saw in the previous slide, more than half of refugees live outside of camp, where they just attend national schools and mix up with everyone. Enrollment rates among refugee children are low compared to nationals. And while most barriers to access education do not specifically relate to refugee status per se, additional efforts are needed to meet specific needs of refugees and overcome some obstacle to the enrollment and attendance, such as language training, flexible certified learning program, psychological support, etc. And this is even more important with recent emergencies. Enrollment rate also lower in rural areas than in urban areas, and access rate falls as education level rise. Girls' education is also further challenged by social cultural factors, such as early marriage, forced marriage, early pregnancies that we saw in the previous slide. Before I take a closer look at Chad, I just want to do a side note. As you can see, our region for UNHCR does not cover Mauritania. Well, it might be covered for some bureau when they focus on West Central Africa. Mauritania hosts over 112,000 refugees and asylum seekers. The vast majority are from Mali. Malians in the Beira camp represent the vast majority, 77% of refugees in the country, and they still follow the Malian curriculum for now. And refugees in urban areas, on the other hand, are integrated into national schools. But the Mauritanian government, supported by UNHCR and partners, is working on an about 10-year transition plan to transfer from the Malian curriculum to the Mauritanian one, and this is set to start next year. Next slide, please. So we're gonna zoom in a little bit on Chad, which we briefly mentioned earlier. So as you saw, Chad is the country in the West Central Africa region that hosts the largest number of refugees. And since the current crisis in Sudan, the overall refugee population has actually doubled. Chad is the only UNHCR operation in this region that underwent and completed a full curricular transition. So this is what we're going to look into. So first of all, refugees from Sudan started to arrive in the mid-2000s, and they were following the Sudanese curriculum, returning to Sudan each year to participate in national exams. Given the protractedness of the situation and to align with other refugees, which were also in Chad, mainly from CAR, and who were following the Chadian curriculum, the Ministry of Education decided in 2012 that all refugees should now be following the Chadian curriculum. This would ensure better inclusion, lower protection risk of having to return to Sudan to take exams, and be more cost effective in the short and long term. The curriculum transition itself, it took 2 years and targeted primary and secondary level simultaneously. So for the 2014-2015 school year, all refugees in Chad started to follow the Chadian curriculum. And at the end of the school year, some Sudanese starting to obtain national diplomas from Chad. Chad has a bilingual system where French and Arabic can be taught. And so for Sudanese, it was the Arabic system that was followed, which also facilitated the transition. Another big step towards this inclusion was in 2018, when all the schools in refugee camps and sites officially transitioned from the status of community schools to the status of official public schools, meaning and hoping to have greater responsibility from the government. The presentation has stopped, but I will continue to talk while it comes back. Other step was in 2019. UNHCR launched its first refugee education, its global education strategy for inclusion. So UNHCR in Chad decided to contextualize the strategy to having one specifically for the country. And that was developed in partnership with the community, the Ministry of Education, and partners. The strategy was officially endorsed by the Minister of Education in 2020. So in Chad, refugees were already included in the education sectoral plan. However, having this document has proven to be also very useful, notably given important staff turnover within partners, within the ministry, within UNHCR. This is a country where things move quickly, so having one line has proven very useful. Thank you. I'm still on the same slide. So now that we've seen this overall picture, I'll just highlight 5 key aspects that I thought were good to share with you on this transition before we then look at challenges. So one important aspect within this whole transition was community mobilization and involvement of local actors. It was key to ensure adherence to the transition because renouncing your home curriculum can be very challenging, and it was not meant without resistance from the refugees. So ensuring a continuing dialogue with refugees, host communities was very important, as well as having local authorities involved in the process and up to today. Collaboration, collaboration with the Ministry of Education and education partner is also very important. You can't work in silos. UNHCR has maintained to keep a very good relationship with the Ministry of Education over the years, is very involved in the local education group, as well as the education cluster, co-leads the refugee education working group. One interesting aspect of this working group is that from 2016, this group met every trimester and was connected to all field offices in the country. And each field office was inviting representative from the refugees, local authorities, and all partners, so that the dialogue includes everyone, which then was very great when COVID happened because we still could connect. Number 3, and we've talked a lot about it, robust data. So as you can see in the slide, in 2012, once the transition was acted, what we did was that UNHCR developed its data collection system, and it was standardized across all camps inside. And this allowed to have a clear vision of what we need, how do we measure progress, and also advocacy. In 2017, we introduced tablets to collect data, and this allowed to link it to our refugee database and to try to go a bit deeper with the data that we have. It's challenging. It's still a lot of challenges, but it's a work in progress. Number 4, teachers, very important. Since the start of the transition, refugee teachers can attend 2-year teaching schools, and they can obtain the same certificate as national teachers. The Ministry of Education also appointed Chadian teachers in refugee camp to facilitate the transition. We organize regular training with local authorities, and we have some system in place for mentoring between Chadian and Sudanese teachers in the camps in the East. And last but not least, 5, certification, access to higher education, extremely important. In Chad, the way you take your end of high school exam is a bit specific, like you don't take it in your school, but you go to an exam center. So UNHCR and partners partnered with the Ministry of Education to have examination centers close to the camp to facilitate access. And in 2020, we actually had the first one ever inside a camp because of COVID at that time, but we managed to keep it over the years. We also have worked with universities. You can see on the slide also some MOUs with public universities to ensure equal access, and with private universities to facilitate some discounts. But this inclusion comes with a lot of challenges, which I'll touch in the next slide. So next slide, please. Yes, thank you. So being included in the system doesn't mean sitting in the same room. It means much more than that. And those challenges have been touched on the previous presentation, so I can go a bit quicker over it because I think I'm at the end of my 10 minutes. Funding, very important. They're not in order of which one is the most complicated or which one is the most important. But although some countries have begun to formally include refugees in recent sectoral documents such as Chad, Niger, Cameroon, CAR, this has not been concretely matched with by finance allocation in refugee hosting school. We saw, for instance, in previous slide, how tertiary enrollment was low, 4%, because while refugees may have access to universities for now, they don't necessarily have access to national financial aid program. And in the case of Chad, in general, for funding, most schools in refugee camp depends heavily on funding from UNHCR and partners. Education systems capacity is a huge challenge in West and Central Africa. High pressure on existing infrastructure, insanely big ratios in the classroom, lack of teachers. We saw in the slides at the beginning how some countries rely heavily on community teachers, and so once refugee arrived, the capacity was not even there in the first place for local communities. So adding this pressure on top of it is a big challenge. Alternative support programs also are needed. There's a lack of a transition program, accelerated programs, and also psychological support for refugees experiencing trauma, and etc. Coordination is a big challenge. Risk of duplication in a country like Chad that is so big, it's also very hard to coordinate, and one decision in N'Djamena, in the capital city, may not be applied in the field. And I remember 1 year in Chad, we tried to have the harmonized school fees across all the camps, and we never managed to put it in place because each camp was deciding something. And also it's not just with international or higher actors, but even also with community, it can be a challenge. And inclusion in education management and information system is a big challenge. In Chad, we have quite a good system to collect data, but it's by UNHCR, and refugees are not really included in the national system, or it was not necessarily on purpose. It was just that they were in that school. So they remain invisible, and then it's complicated to make them visible in the system. Chad participated along Kenya, Cameroon, and Mauritania in a study by Cambridge Education that has proven to be quite useful for us who were working in Chad at the time, and UNHCR in general, to see, okay, where we're standing and what we need to work on. And finally, last slide, if you want to know more about, we can go to the last slide, I'm done. If we want to know more about UNHCR, our activities, you're very well invited to go to our Global Focus website, where you will also find our 2024 appeal and plan, and more about data, and a lot of publication, including the West Central Africa education newsletter. You all can also visit the data portal with the links there. That's it for me. Thank you. And please feel free to send questions.
Thank you so much, Priscilla. And we would now hand over to Florencia from UNESCO.
Thank you, Sirenia. Really happy to be here representing the LAC region. The objective of my presentation is to outline the main challenges regarding the guarantee of the right to education for people on the move in our region, and how we are attempting to address it through UNESCO's work. Next, please. So here are some of the massive migratory flows that we have in our region. The region has hosted over 80% of the Venezuelan migrant population. We also have an important return movements to El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras in the last years. And also we have the exodus of Central and South American people towards to the United States. Just to, next please. Just to illustrate the magnitude of the migratory movements in the region, This table allow us to see the scale and the speed at which Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru have welcomed Venezuelan students into their classrooms. The year 2019 stands out for the significant growth, but the upward trend continues in 2020 and 2021, despite mobility restrictions imposed during the pandemic. Therefore, it can be inferred that the people on the move continue to enter to these national education systems during this period. I would like to show now some of the progress and challenges. Some of these ideas have been already mentioned before from other presentations, but we have some synergies that I think is important to present here. Next, please. Next, thank you. Regarding legal frameworks for the inclusion of students on the move, countries in the LAC region have made regulatory advancement to reduce barriers to access to primary and secondary education. Some of this was already mentioned by Arthur. But this regulation usually take the form of circulars or official letters, not laws, and this change need to have more status. Also, there is a lack of sustainability in financing and implementation challenges at different territorial levels, conditions that that make difficult to see the changes that these regulatory norms have already made on the territory. And also, despite of several countries having universalized some supplementary services, such as school food, scholarships, and school materials, in many cases, having regular migration status remains as a requirement. So these are some of the challenges regarding the legal frameworks. Next, please. About the availability and the data uses, in a survey conducted by UNESCO Santiago in 2022 involving 17 countries in the region, 13 claim information about students on the move, so that is a good news. But of these, 10 countries have nominal data, and 12 mention having information about public and private educational institutions from early childhood education to secondary education. So we see that many countries have improved their EMIs to incorporate more data regarding students on the move. Next, please, sorry. The data on students on the move generated by these EMIs are often used with varying emphasis. First, for planning, second, to identification and targeting of interventions, and also to develop some policies and support programs to ensure access to education and other social protection interventions. But it's still necessary to use this data to planning and also to implement some specific interventions. Last year, next please, we made this report, is only available in Spanish, but the report was focused on Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, which are the three main countries which have accommodate almost 71% of the Venezuelan migratory flows in the region. And this report had the objective to identify changes made in response to the migration, especially those aimed at improving the availability and quality of educational information for Venezuelan migrants and their families within the EMIs. In conclusion, the report showcased that there have been substantial advancement in Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru aimed to integrate students on the move into their educational statistics. And these developments include the adaptability of their systems, the successful identification of students on the move, and the provision of statistics through accessible data repositories. A key consideration is whether to include more detailed information about the students on the move, with the suggestion that this can be achieved through system interoperability without overloading the EMIs. In this report, we identified main challenges in the production and usages of information from EMIs, from a regional perspective and also from a national perspective. Next slide, please. And I would like to share some of them with you. From the regional perspective, there is a challenge in improving the identification and characterization of students on the move, and to advance in the harmonization of variables for identifying these students. It's necessary also to generate more information on educational pathways and their interruptions, and to characterize the vulnerabilities and specific needs of students on the move. And from the perspective of national EMIs, it's necessary to enhance the identification and characterization of these students, to utilize also the data for education and planning, to strengthen interoperability, as I already mentioned, with other state information and management systems, and also to improve accessibility to information. Next, please. In response to these challenges, UNESCO Santiago, along with 18 countries in the region, has proposed the development of a regional framework for monitoring the situation of students on the move as a joint initiative to build comparable national and regional indicators. These works contribute to evidence-based educational policy development that can more effectively address the challenges posed by the human mobility in the region. In meetings held in 2021 and 2022, the subgroups discuss. We create 2 subgroups from countries in the region, and we discuss and define the conceptual framework that guides these monitoring frameworks, and agree on a conceptual reference for students on the move. And then we establish a committee of countries that develop a proposal of indicators from this framework. Then the technical working group approved this proposal a year ago. And following this, a piloting process took place in 2023 to collect indicators information at the national levels. And we have six countries in the region that participate in this process, sharing their respective information. And now UNESCO is analyzing the pilot results, which are set to be shared with the technical table. So this is a regional initiative that I would like to share with you. We have a website from this regional monitoring framework that is being developed now, but I would like to share the link from our website with you at the chat. So that's my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Florencia, for your intervention. Before I move to the Q&A, I will hand over for a minute to Josiah Kaplan from UNICEF Innocenti to give a brief announcement.
Selenia, thank you so much. I hope you can hear me. I want to start with sincere apologies. This introduction is coming at the tail end when it should have come at the beginning. But I wanted to take a moment to thank Rachel Marcus from ODI for providing such an excellent overview of UNICEF Innocenti's study. Just to say, with quite exciting timing, the report itself has launched this morning. I've included a link in the chat below, and we would be very happy as well to follow up bilaterally with any participants of this webinar who would like to discuss more. But I just wanted to end quickly with a very sincere thanks to Rachel, her colleague Susan Nicolai, Carmen Lon Himmelstein, the rest of the ODI team, and of course, Evan Easton Calabria from UNICEF Innocenti, and our colleagues at UNICEF Education for such a tremendous report, and very exciting to see it join with colleagues on this call in what I think is becoming an established area of leadership. So thank you all. That's all.
Thank you so much, Josiah. So we'll go into the Q&A, given that we only have about 10 minutes. So I'm going to relay some of the questions The first one is for Lily. Lily, please comment on this one. And then if the other panelists have thoughts, please also come in. So the question is, one of the main issues when it comes to inclusion is the perspective of beneficiaries themselves, as sometimes they are against inclusion. Has this factor been examined? This relates to a question also posed by another participant on the Ukrainian situation, where there has been a preference for maintaining the home country curriculum.
Thanks, and thanks for this question. Yeah, I think it's an important one. And the way that our research was designed, we were really looking more at system-specific analysis, right? So we were looking at policies and data. And so in our research design, we didn't include specific refugee perspectives per se. But nonetheless, I've included in my response an example that in Chad, we found, as was raised by other presenters, that some groups of refugees have some resistance to switching to the national curriculum. And one thing that we found was really key in facilitating that switch was the advocacy of UNHCR with local communities and speaking with local community leaders to help the communities understand why the switch was happening. So that's just one example, but again, our research didn't look systematically at the refugee perspective. So I think other studies would be better placed to do that. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Lily. Does anybody else want to come in on this question?
Serena, I can comment quickly to talk about the specific case of Chad. That answers also another question that was in the chat, the 2-year transition. Yeah, we had a lot of resistance in Chad in some camps for the transition. Main factors was that the Sudanese curriculum was considered to be stronger, of better quality. Also, compulsory education is a year shorter in Sudan, so they thought we're losing a year pretty much. There was attachment, obviously, to the curriculum. And there was also an economic system that happened around having a parallel system. So refugees would cross back to Sudan to take the exams. There were some tutoring classes. So there was kind of a whole environment that this was changing everything. So as Lily mentioned, there was a lot of advocacy done. Resistance happened even after the official transition. We had a camp where we had a parallel system, and it was very hard to work with everyone. There was also culturally in the Sudanese system, you go to school very early and then you have a long pause and then you come back, and the Chadian system was structured differently. So we try also to adapt the schooling hours to ensure that when children were going home for sort of snack, they would come back. We worked a lot also with madrasas, religious school, because there was also a parallel with these two. But it's still, and up to the day I was in Chad 2 years ago, it was still a challenge in some areas. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Priscilla. Does anybody else want to come in on this one? If not, I'll move on to the next question. Okay, great. So I believe this one is for Arthur. When you were completing the overview of refugee education data, how did you define IDPs in long-term conflict situations, where, as you rightly said, children are more integrated? In other words, what parameters did you set around the data that you were going to include?
Sorry, my audio dropped there for a moment. Could you repeat the question?
Yep, sure. When you were completing the overview of refugee education data, how did you define IDPs in long-term conflict situations, where, as you rightly said, children are more integrated? In other words, what parameters did you set around the data that you were going to include in your analysis?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. So what we focused on the top 35 low and middle income refugee hosting countries as of September 2021, right? So we looked at data sources in those 35 countries. Now, those 35 countries do not overlap entirely with the top 35 IDP hosting countries. In fact, there's some big gaps. I think there's probably about 15 or 20 countries that fall out of that. So while we did include some bits on IDP education, simply because they were captured within those data collection exercises that we looked at, really the focus was on refugee education, right? And yeah, I mean, so we only looked at those countries, and I mean, some of those countries do have long-term crises, right? But Pakistan is one of our case studies for that example does. But yeah, it really wasn't distinguishing between those in conflict settings or those for in not in conflict settings, basically, just looking at those countries as a whole without disaggregation, really. And IDPs, again, fall outside of the scope a little bit. I mean, though I think it would be very interesting to continue the work and cover those IDP hosting countries, because based on what we know so far, at least, the IDP education data landscape is actually worse than that for refugee education. So it'd be good to see where we stand.
Great. Thank you so much, Arthur. And maybe one last question. So I think both Arthur and Lily, you pointed out in your presentation that there is basically very little data on refugee education beyond access. There's some on quality. Did you identify any examples where refugees have been purposefully, effectively included in data collection exercises? And do you have any views on what are some of the factors that made that possible? I believe there's some interesting work going on in Latin America and the Caribbean that speaks to some of the points that Florencia mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in quickly. And I mean, I think Latin America has quite a few good examples where even irregular refugees are captured in the education system, right? And this happens across a few countries. I give Peru as an example, but it's not unique in the region. So I think there are countries, but these are also high capacity countries when we talk about Latin America, right? Relatively speaking. And so yes, the data exists. That doesn't necessarily mean it's used. That's another thing altogether, right? But it does exist. It's integrated into an EMIS or an education management information system, which also captures data on individual students, right? And that's very different from a lot of countries where you actually have data that's captured at school level. And it's much more difficult in those contexts to capture data on refugees because it has to be the head teacher or whoever is aggregating the data that reports on those. And that's a very different context. And I think, Chad has been doing some work on that, as we heard, right? But there is less of that kind of work than I mean, we would like, I guess. But Latin America provides a very good example of ways out of this. But again, it's a specific context. And I don't know, Flo, if you want to say more about this.
No, thank you. That was a really good response from Arthur. I think he has a really good experience too in the region. So nothing to add. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. Well, I just wanted to say thank you so much for joining this webinar. I think we've brought together all these different perspectives and these different areas of work around the topic of inclusion from these three different institutions. There's still a lot of work to do. There's still a lot of gaps to cover, but I'm very happy that you were able to join us today. We will try to answer some of the remaining questions that were in the chat. And yeah, with this, I think I will just close the webinar. Thank you all for joining. Have a good rest of your day. Thanks.